Hi, Greg. How you doing?
Hello, Mr. Squire. How's it going today?
Terrible. There's nobody to talk to on Facebook. You got kicked off again.
I know, me and my terrible opinions.
How long did you get kicked off for this time?
Oh, they gave me the 30 days, and this is the interesting thing is they misconstrued what I said quite drastically. So, they took something that couldn't possibly be construed as some sort of an insult and turned it into that. So
Okay, enough said. Enough said. You need to take responsibility for getting kicked off. Um, are you
I'm a bad man.
are you going to get kicked off again? I went and bought a gun today, and the government keeps trying to tell me I'm a felon, and I'm not. You know.
Hmm.
So every time I go to buy ammunition or a gun, they give me a hard time. I've never been convicted of a felony. They keep trying to tell me I have been, which is interesting. After they murdered four of my wives and three of my attorneys and two of my judges, they tell me I'm a felon and try to prevent me from having a gun. It's interesting how this government.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're the ones that need to be prevented from having guns, right? Not
Did
you.
I told you last week, I got a call from a journalist at a music magazine, right?
Yeah, because somebody you knew from school died.
Yeah, a guy I played music with. He was a really good jazz piano player. When I was young, I used to play classical and jazz for the chorus at my school. We had a little group, and we would all play music. So the
He
journalist,
was a rather well-known musician later in his life.
well, he was a studio musician like I was for a time, and he backed up people like Gladys Knight and the Pips and the Supremes and all the black groups in Detroit. He was a studio pianist. All the good black groups wanted him to play piano for them because he was one of the best in Detroit. His name was Gary Schunk. I'm gonna share the screen here, and I got a YouTube. I'll play a little clip of him. Um, this is Gary Schunk, and he and I played together back in 66, 67, 68, 69, 70 for the varsity chorus at Warren, Michigan High School, where I taught science. I was a science teacher there in Warren, and I played in a band with Gary here. And he's a jazz pianist, and this is one of his bands at a little lounge in Detroit. going to stop it there. And that was my friend Gary Schunk. I grew up with him playing music with Gary. And as you can hear, he liked playing jazz. He was a classically trained pianist, and everything he did there, he improvised with his band. He called himself Gary Schunk 4. And this is at the Dirty Dog Jazz Club in Detroit. When Gary, in 2017, Gary would have been about 64, 65 years old. So he spent his lifetime, I stopped that share and now it's just me. He spent his lifetime playing jazz in Detroit clubs, and he was a pianist in recording studios in Detroit. And he would back up people like Gladys Knight and the Pips and the Supremes, all the black groups. He would play piano for them in the studios for their albums.
Well, speaking of jazz, you had some experience with another jazz musician named J.C. Hurd.
Yeah, J.C.
Tell me a little bit about him.
He was a personal friend of mine in Oakland County, Michigan. I grew up knowing him as his paper boy. And I used to stop in a club where he would play with people like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie. And now and then I'd sit in and play drums at the club he was playing in, and he was a personal friend. He was in Tokyo. He won a drum off jazz drummers, and he was declared the best jazz drummer on earth back when I was about 18 years old. And he has a surviving son, and I'm not sure if his wife is still alive or not, but I got the phone call from a jazz magazine. They wanted me to put some, I play with Gary, so they wanted to talk to me about an article they were writing about Gary's life. And as I'm talking to the journalist at the Music Mag, he told me Gary Schunk died. And that's why I was doing the article. And I had no idea my friend Gary died. I mean, young, 60, he probably was 66, 67. I didn't expect Gary to die. I talked to Gary in 2018 or 2017. And he told me he got my name and phone number off the funeral list. There's only one problem with that. Gary died and was, his funeral is at Bonaventure in Detroit, St. Bonaventure. And I'm in California and I wasn't at his funeral.
Yeah, you're not quite that close there to it right now.
No, I'm 3,000 miles away. So somebody,
and yet somehow you were on the the little sign in where you go into the funeral and you sign your name. I assume that's where that's where this guy got your name.
Yeah, somebody impersonated me at Gary's funeral, my friend Gary Schunk.
Yeah.
And every musician in Detroit into jazz and rock and roll, and Smokey Robinson and Gladys Knight and the Supremes, they would have been at his funeral, and somebody pretended they were me at his funeral.
Yeah, so that it begs the question why they would do that, when I think the answer is rhetorical, but go ahead and tell them why you think they did that.
Well, so they could get in close proximity to all the famous artists in Detroit. If you
so to sum it up, a guy is pretending to be you at a funeral of your friend to get contacts with big name musicians.
Correct, yeah. And this has been done to me all my life. Like I just turned 68, and this just happened within the past 6 months. So I get a call from a journalist writing an article about my friend Gary Schunk. He wants my input for his magazine article. And somebody's impersonating me at the funeral, and they're using my name and my phone number. I own Bottomline Publishing New York, and this is nothing new to me. My entire life has been stolen. my trademark, my publishing license, my IRS license, my name, Hugh Squier, was stolen worldwide back in the 70s, 1969, 1970. I had 28,000 worldwide entertainment contracts stolen that were attached to my name.
Now, of course, this reporter, he was calling to get information about Gary Schunk, but you started to tell him a little bit about your experiences and your story. And this guy's a reporter. And when you're starting to tell somebody about your connections to Hoffa and 9/11 and Kennedy and all this, so you would think that as a reporter, you know, your I don't know, radar would buzz or something. I don't know
Well,
what the right words are. You would be like, hey, what am I hearing here?
not only was he a reporter, Greg, he was the head production at two Detroit radio stations, 99.1 and WDET Detroit for years. 30 or 40 years, he was had production at those two radio stations. They hide my truth of being kidnapped and my twin murdered, and then my four wives being murdered. But then they call me for articles about, aliens or people I played with because other people are impersonating me all over the world. They don't
Well,
want
because
they don't want
well,
the truth of Kennedy. They don't want the
right.
truth of Hoffa or Kennedy or my murdered wives. I'm BLM, and they gave you BLM with the Bundys, and then they gave you Black Lives Matter, and they hide my trademark BLM in New York, Bottomline music, and all the murders in my life. And they've been doing this for 7 decades, Greg, and you know this, but the rest of the world doesn't. It was interesting that the guy who called me, who's a journalist at the Music Mag, there's a policeman in Wisconsin where my fiance, Sarah Heath Palin's family was murdered on the Manning Ranch that I bought for her on my birthday, July 4th in 2003. Now, the journalist who called me, the policeman in Wisconsin, a detective in Wisconsin, has the same name as the guy that owned the radio stations in Michigan. And Terry was kidnapped by 2 off-duty policemen in Wisconsin out of her Head Start CPS office. And they kidnapped her and took her across 3 state lines. And that's when I bought her the ranch, the Manning Ranch, and moved her to it. And then 6 months later, she was dead, murdered. And so, they called her murder-suicide because it was police who kidnapped her. They were off duty when they kidnapped her, but that doesn't change the fact that they were police. And none of this has ever been in the news. So this call from the Music Mag is, and the guy that owned 2 radio stations in Detroit, and now is a journalist for jazz music, who knows people I played with all the way back in the 60s, 50s. I was with Gary Schunk. And we played for the varsity chorus, and we had a little band. And anywhere the chorus and 12th grade at Warren played, I and Gary played. We were the backup music. Mm-hmm. And somebody's impersonating me.
Well, is it possible that the reporter that has the same name as the police from the state where your wife was murdered or kidnapped, rather? Is it possible that maybe that he is actually the police officer and not really a reporter and was just pretending to be a reporter?
I looked into it, and that police officer, it wasn't him. He's no longer alive.
Okay.
But it's just interesting how my life is. How a police officer right in the city that kidnapped my future wife and then murdered her, is the same name as the journalist who owned two Detroit radio stations. But that's all I wanted to say about Gary Schunk. Gary was a really good jazz pianist. And when I was playing with Gary, I was friends with J.C. Hurd, who was playing drums in Tokyo at the drum off, jazz drum off in Tokyo at the time. And then Gary replaced a pianist at Steppenwolf, where we went to school. John left and went back to California. Gary took his place, and then I and Gary played together for 2 or 3 years. And I haven't seen him since it's about 69, about 72. But he went on to be a studio musician in Detroit and play all the jazz clubs. And I played rock and roll in all the Detroit, Chicago, and Toronto, Canada clubs for 50 years. And he played jazz for 50 years. I played rock and roll. The last 2 clubs I played in were one for Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas, Cafe Dina Marie's, across the street from my college. And then I played at Ted Nugent's iRock solo. And then I retired from music, and I bought that ranch in Tennessee for Terry Heath, who was murdered. And then 7 years after they murdered Terry Heath, they came back and murdered my next wife, Victoria Mellon. My life has been a cascade of murders of children and women since I was kidnapped at 4 and my own twin was murdered in Oakland County, Michigan. And Gary Schunk called himself the Gary Schunk 4, and I was kidnapped at 4, and we both lived in Oakland County, and it's not coincidence.
It's fascinating. And also, J.C. Hurd happens to have the same first name as J.C. Christensen as well, and I've kind of found that interesting.
Yeah. I don't want to go into that, but I work for Christensen. We built tools for the auto company for years. The other thing I find interesting in my life at the moment is this pedophile arrested in Arkansas, Mueller, MEAL, like meal, ER, Mueller. He was arrested for 50 counts of child molestation of one of his band members. He was a teacher in a band in Arkansas. And Gary and we played for Towers in the chorus prior to the Twin Towers, which isn't coincidence. And Towers took my baby pictures back in the 50s. And then the Twin Towers.
George Towers, not just Towers, but George Towers.
Yeah,
like
it was
George
George
Bush
Towers.
Towers.
George Bush said my name on 9/11 as the first plane hit the towers. None of that's coincidence. And that was hiding my civil rights case and the theft of Bottomline, my trademark and publishing company. And it was worldwide theft. It was a federal publishing license. And I and Gary were 2 of the best white musicians coming out of Detroit. We both played nonstop for 50 years. That's how we supported ourselves. Gary actually taught it at one of the colleges, music.
Pratt had something to do with this story too.
Yeah, the Mueller, the guy, he was found dead the day after he was arrested, the band director at the Harrison School, and I'm the Harris family. And Pratt is the superintendent of Harrison Schools, or the principal, I forget which, but Pratt, on the day I was kidnapped at 4, actually cut my father's hands off with a Behringer. And Pratt and Behringer had a museum in Napa Valley that caught on fire when I visited there in about 2017. Napa Valley, the whole mountain got set on fire as I passed the Pratt Behringer Museum. And Pratt and and Cameron, my next door neighbor, were the two merchant marines that died on the Edmund Fitzgerald after I lived on an Indian reservation with the Lightfoot family. And in my life, none of that's coincidence. I found all of that interesting. I'm really, I hope the people who were at Gary's funeral in Detroit, I'm sure like Gladys Knight would have been there, and maybe Smokey Robinson, and if any of the Supremes are still alive, they would have been at Gary's funeral, and somebody impersonated me. So if any of those artists see this video, I hope they didn't give that guy a job using my name and phone number. But this is the story of my life, Greg, and you know that.
Yeah, they've stolen your trademarks and everything about your life for your entire life. Even made a Bottomline a bar where so many musicians got their start in New York, and
Yeah, all the top rock and roll artists, Bruce Springsteen, they got their start there. As I was in Detroit playing all the big clubs in Detroit, I played. I started out playing for the NFL, and then the linebackers, the Washington family, and the world heavyweight deadlift champion. All these people were my family and friends. And
so the musicians stole your trademark, and so did the WWF.
Yeah.
And so did Kennedy's press secretary when he wrote a book by that name, Bottomline. And so did
with my next door neighbor Nagy, who was Lee Iacocca's son-in-law. That's correct, Greg.
And which black singer, I can't think of her name right off, sang that song Bottomline?
Diana Ross.
Diana Ross, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Gary was the backup artist on the albums.
Yeah, amazing. Right. So it's obvious that she knew what she was doing.
Yeah, they were my Detroit neighbors. I was born in Detroit. I was born on 8 Mile and Outer Drive.
8 Mile. Oh, that's the name of a rapper's album here.
Yeah, Eminem. As I bought Mary Miller a house, they found Hoffa's blood in. And this is not. And then they detained me for Hoffa's murder before they detained Chucky O'Brien, the FBI. But
what are the chances? Yeah, nobody knows who you are, right?
Yeah, and Miller wrote a book about how they found the blood in a spot of Hoffa's blood in the house I bought for Miller. And Miller and Tony Tocco worked for me. And they wrote books and made movies about Miller and Tocco. And now they're writing a book about barrels in Jersey, as the media lies to me and never mentions that I was the first guy the FBI arrested, and my mother-in-law was Hoffa's date that night. It's real interesting, my life. And now I
makes me think, because Tocco and the other guy made those books, and they were accepted, and their stories are fraud. Makes me think that they worked for the government and maybe were close to you to hide the truth.
Well, there's no might be about it. Right now you have Kamala Harris using the Harris name. I'm the Harris family. My family's been in the Smithsonian for 150 years with the Harris steam thrashers and Massey Ferguson. And Clara Harris was with Lincoln as he was shot in Ford Theater by the actor Booth. That's all my family, the Harris family. Which was Mr. Harris married Mrs. Fuller, my grandmother, and then she was Edgar Allan Poe's literary critic in London. And then that whole family was run over by a semi leaving church on Clinton River Road. And then you got the Clintons, and then Clinton and Obama's White House murdered two of my wives on the Manning Ranch and gave you Bradley and Chelsea Manning. And nobody's in jail for any of these murders. And these are 4 generations of kids murdered in my family. 4 generations, Greg. Kids run over by semis raped and dismembered and thrown on my family's properties, my own family's kids, my own twin, and nobody's gone to jail. And the person responsible for that, L. Brooks Patterson, they called him a hero when he died, and he never solved a single murder in my life. Of all those Oakland County kids, that's not a hero, that's a loser. L. Brooks Patterson was a loser who hid the truth of JFK's murder. And
Yeah, his friends really elevated him, but he wasn't well liked as by a whole lot too. Yeah,
oh,
there's
he
a lot
was
of people
terrible.
really.
He
Yeah,
was
really didn't like him.
prosecutor in Detroit, and you had Kamala Harris was prosecutor in California around the time L. Brooks Patterson died 2 years ago. And then Huey Lewis and Billy Squier stole my first and last name, as Bottomline was stolen by Steve Austin and DuPont for the WWF. And the World Wildlife Federation took them to court, but because they had murdered me several times, it took me too long to get back on my feet to protect my trademark Bottomline. And then they murdered 3 of my attorneys and 2 of my judges as they murdered my wife. So I could never get back on my feet and protect my publishing license, which was a federal publishing license in New York, Bottomline, fully federal court. So they got away with stealing my trademark. Until now, I'm never going to let it go. I'm going to talk about it until I die now. And I do have open murder cases now.
Right. And that's why you hear, and that's the bottom line, because Stone Cold
Yeah,
said
and because
so.
the police are involved in those murders, they turn a blind eye to all the murders. That's why nobody's in jail. 2 police chiefs told me, well, let's just leave these murders up to God instead of making out murder reports in Tennessee. My wife,
I think that's what Stone Cold is referring to. I mean, when someone's murdered, they're stone cold, right? So I think that's.
Yeah, well, they just remembered and murdered 2 of my wives, and then the police chief in Johnson City, Tennessee, just says let's leave the murder up to God, and then never filed a murder report on a dismembered body, So I finally got a murder case opened up in that murder of my wife. And they murdered my attorney on the same day. And then they put the reporter who destroyed my income online as they murdered my wife. They put him on a takeout. And his name is Major Tom Garrett. He completely destroyed my income online as they murdered my wife and attorney and gave the world Bradley Manning. And CBS was so thankful that they hid my truth. Kennedy and Manning and Garrison, that they put him on the takeout and probably gave him a raise as he destroyed my income. Then in Detroit.
Since you've been exposing that, and the fact that he was passing himself off with the name Tom instead of Major there for a while, now CBS has, I believe, hired another guy, I think, named Tom Garrett. So they're even trying to hide that through him.
Yeah. And the Tom Garrett that destroyed my business, he destroyed it right from the White House. He was Obama's journalist in the White House. It was Major Tom Garrett. I have that paperwork, but it'll be, if it ever gets to court, it'll be a century again. These people have murdered kids and women and millions of innocent people using my money and name, and they pretend they're me. And they do it at funerals so they can get work and steal whatever was mine. And I come from very famous families. I'm related to presidents. I
believe you said you're the last male of the Harris line that came from Clara Harris.
Yeah, my mother's brother was killed run over by a semi with 3 of his sisters when my mother was 7. So Kamala Harris isn't that family, and she's not my family. And I'm not, you can see I'm not Asian or black, and she's both, and she's not my family, but she's pretending to be because of Harris polls and Harris being with Lincoln and Harris in the Smithsonian. She's not that family, and she's not Harris Publishing. That's my family. Harris Publishing doesn't even exist anymore. They owned 264 worldwide magazines like Look and Life, big magazines that were worldwide. When we gave you computers through my family member Gates and Gardner and Jacobs, those are all my family members.
Essentially,
We got out of the magazine business, the Harris family. So she's riding on the Harris name, trying to get votes, pretending she's my family when she's not.
yeah, she's not doing anything
You
different
need to
than
let
what
me.
this.
You need to let me finish. You've cut me off a dozen times.
Go ahead.
Billy Squier, his real name is Craig. Kamala Harris, her real name should be Emhoff. And she was prosecutor in California as they stole my trademark Bottomline and my likeness, Huey and Squier. Billy Squier was Queen's lead guitar player, and his real name is Craig, Craig. And with Gary Schunk, Craig Towers was one of the singers in Warren Heights. And Craig Towers' father, Del Towers, was the chorus teacher. And then George Towers took my baby pictures with twin towers on them, a 2 and a 4, as I was kidnapped at 4. And all of this is related to 9/11 truth. And then the chief of police who replaced Gilbert Hill, who I know the Hill family. I was with Eddie Murphy and Gilbert Hill, the chief of police in Florida, Key West, Florida, when they made the movie, Eddie Murphy's first movie, where a semi crashes into a fire hydrant, semis full of cigarettes. I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was one of Eddie Murphy's first comedies. And the chief of police was in it, and I was staying at Hemingway's house, and we all drove back together.
Beverly Hills Cop, maybe?
I don't, yeah, that was the name of it. And we all drove back together to Detroit and ate key lime pie. We ate his mother's key lime pie. Gilbert Hill and Eddie Murphy and me. And then the man who now is prosecutor in Detroit is Mr. Craig, the very family that stole my last name, Squier, and he's a black man. He's chief of police in Detroit, replacing Gilbert Hill. And Kamala Harris is stealing the Harris name and pretending to be a black woman. She's not. She's probably got a good suntan booth in her basement. These people are all entertainment lawyers. Her Obama and Michelle were lawyers. They gave up their lawyer degrees when they went into the White House. And their White House murdered my wives and covered it up in the news on the Manning Ranch and gave the world Bradley Manning as they murdered my wife and Tom Garrett. And my wife was Terry Heath. That's Sarah Heath Palin's family. And then they murdered Miss Mellon from Pennsylvania. They dismembered and murdered these women. And they wrote on dismembered bodies, they wrote natural causes. And no murder cases open. The chief of police, my attorneys were murdered. And these are two prosecutors, a prosecutor in California using the Harris name, and chief of police in Detroit using my last name, Squier. And then they murder my wives, and they put a fake felony on my police record. They keep preventing me from defending myself with a gun or buying ammo with fake felonies on my Detroit records, and I'm not a felon. I've never been convicted of a felony. And I was a priest. I went to Catholic school to be a priest. I owned a ministry in Tennessee, and they keep putting fake felonies on my record to prevent me from having a gun and defending myself as they murdered 4 of my wives. They dismembered, sodomized, and murdered 4 of my wives, the government. And now they're using my first and last name and my mother's name. And this is what's really going on in my life. And then I get calls from journalists at magazines, music magazines, who own radio stations, telling me I was at my friend's funeral and I was 3,000 miles away in California. So all of you people, I'm the real Hugh Squier, and you're all being conned. And I don't even know who the con artists are. They show up everywhere, and they're prosecutors and chiefs of police, and they're really murdering kids and women in my life all across the country, all around the globe. They're murdering innocent people to hide my truth of who really killed Kennedy. And if you got anything else to add, go right ahead, Greg.
I was just thinking that Craig and Squire and Harris and all these, they're no different than this person at the funeral we originally were talking about, just stealing your identity.
No, they're just the same. They're hiding pedophilia and murders. They dismember or sodomize women, murder them. And they mark me in all movies and media and music, but they never admit I exist, as they detain me for Hoffa's murder, and I wasn't anywhere near Hoffa when he disappeared. My mother-in-law was. Had nothing to do with me. I was in my truck driving to strip clubs in Detroit. Had nothing to do with Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. A complete